This cars passage felt pretty good.
Happy feet. One more combo. That ain't Falco. That ain't Falco.
Recording. So recently I've had a lot of free time. This might be because we're currently in the middle of a global health crisis and because I'm a second semester senior taking intermediate tennis online, but who really knows, you know? After borrowing the new Pokemon game and then proceeding to dump a light 27 hours into it over the next 4 days, I finally decided it was time to do something else with my life. That thing I decided to do was to make a YouTube video to help you guys have as painless of an MCAT experience as possible. So the main reason I'm making a video about this is because when I was studying for the MCAT, I noticed something pretty interesting on the MCAT Reddit. For those who don't know, the MCAT subreddit is this amazing resource where you can really feel like you're studying without, you know, like actually studying. It's also a resource you can use to get answers to problems online or just like generally feel a sense of community as you suffer through studying for the MCAT. Just understand that Reddit is a very slippery slope, so if you have no self-control, then you might accidentally lose a couple hours to extraneous circumstance. Anyways, on the Reddit MCAT, people do this interesting thing where they post their full-length scores as they take them in order. So you'll basically see a trend of like 4 scores over time before they take the actual test. These trends on your practice tests typically reflect your level of preparation for the exam. However, what I was noticing is a lot of these people didn't really see many fluctuations in their score. So for example, they would just kind of have like a consistent distribution of like maybe 5-point increases from their first practice test to their last one, or they just had a consistently good score all the way throughout. After studying for about 4 weeks, my full-length trend looked like this. And I basically just want to share with you how I got these results, the plan I used to study, and my advice on how to improve your MCAT score quickly so you guys may also see results like this. The first thing you're going to want to do, and I didn't want to do this either when I first started, is take a practice test and bomb the hell out of it. This is the most important thing you can do before you start studying. Because the truth is you can review bio and physics or any of the concepts on the MCAT before you take a test, but you're not maximizing the efficiency of your studying unless you understand how the concepts are tested in test format while you're studying. Like, it changes the game. You'll notice that I took an actual full length to do this, but you don't have to. And in fact, I would actually suggest you take the sample test, which is basically the same thing as a full length test that AMC provides, but it doesn't give you like an exact score. Because the whole point of taking a practice test before you start studying is basically just to understand where you're at before you start and to see how the material is being tested in test format. Not getting an exact score on the sample test is really not such a big deal, and I highly recommend you take a sample test rather than a full length before you start studying as a diagnostic. When I took my first practice test, I kind of had an unfortunate situation that destroyed my confidence at the time. Basically, all the friends that I was relying on for information about the MCAT are just really, really brilliant people. Their brains are so big, they don't understand what it's like to struggle on anything. So now they're out here gassing me up too, like, yeah, Aiden, you could get a 505 on your first practice test without studying. I mean, that's usual. That's what usually happens to people, right? Yeah, you know, you're pretty big brain too. I think you could definitely get a 520 if you wanted to.
Oh yeah, dude, for sure.
So, foolish as I was and not knowing anything about MCAT in general, I was like, you know what, like, I'm a bio major, I majored in neuroscience, like, I'm pretty comfortable with orgo, I'm a decent test taker, I'm feeling the 505. I think I could probably get a 505 on this first practice test. So, on the day of the test, I got up at noon, dusted myself off, and proceeded to confidently drop the fattest 497 of all time. Now, getting over a bad practice test score is probably going to happen to everyone, and not gonna lie, it does take some time. For sure. As dismayed as I was, my test date was still in January, so I had 4 weeks to prepare, and I figured if I could go up 5 points every week, I would still be on track to apply with a pretty good score. Over the time, I originally wanted a 515 plus, but you know, as you study, which is a painful process, your standards like lower a little bit, so I would have been cool with anything over a 512. Obviously, a 512 may be like an amazing score to some people, or just like an awful score to others. But the point is you want to set your goals before you start studying because it'll help you understand how much more you need to study in order to be ready for test day and what you're shooting for in the schools you want to apply to when you actually take the MCAT. So without further ado, here's how I prepare for the MCAT and what I think is most important to improving your score quickly.
Just waking up in the morning, gotta thank God. I don't know, but today seems kinda odd.
So, you finally start studying, and you rapidly realize that it sucks. To save you some suffering, let's talk about a quick and effective way you can review the ungodly amount of material there is on the MCAT. If you've just taken a practice test, the first thing you should do is write down everything wrong you got on the practice test. Anytime you take a practice test or a problem set or anything related to studying, you should get in the habit of writing down what you got wrong and reviewing it over and over again. I'll go into more detail about why this is important later in the video. Now that that's done, it's time for content review. For this, you're going to want to get your hands on a book set. Personally, I use Kaplan and I really like them, but there are many different kinds out there. Just make sure you get one. Now that you have the content review books in your hands, you're probably thinking, damn, she's thick! Don't worry, there's a key to getting through these quickly, and it's believing in the high yield. If a topic in the review book set has a high yield label, that means it's a subject that's most likely to be tested on the MCAT. The main factor in getting a good test score on test day is just knowing the high yield material. It's the most likely to come up, so you have to play the odds in your favor. These sections you're going to want to thoroughly review, whether that's just reading it really carefully or taking notes, whatever works best for you, make sure you understand the material. Where I think most people lose time in their first time reviewing the content is in the low yield sections. This is because every now and then the MCAT will test what I like to call specific, unimportant conceptual knowledge. And it pretty much sucks every time it happens. This is when you're just chilling, taking a biology section, getting free money on amino acid questions, minding your own business, and then AAMC decides to ask you what the fourth enzyme of the pentose phosphate pathway is. So now you got trust issues. Now you're out here worried that if you can't recite all 8 B vitamins' name and function, AMC is not going to allow you to be a doctor. As much as you want to obsess over low yield and suck questions, don't be that guy the first time through. That's because at the end of each chapter, there's a chapter review section. This section summarizes the information from each section of the chapter. So at the end of the book, it offers a nice, concise review of everything that was covered in the chapter, high yield and low yield. The concise summary of low yield sections at the end of the chapter is more than enough review of this content that you'll need the first time through studying. So, TLDR on your first time through, study the high yield, ignore or skim the low yield, and read the chapter reviews. So I'm not saying that low yield is not important though. In fact, being able to get the low yield questions on the MCAT is the key to getting above that 515 or 520 threshold. The reason you can skim this material in the beginning is because your strategy for solving low yield questions should not be rote memorization of low yield material. Instead, if you have such a good understanding of the high yield material, when you run into a low yield question, you can use process of elimination to get the answer most of the time, or at least narrow it down to a couple choices. Also, remember when I told you to get in the habit of writing down your mistakes? Although the first time you wrote down your mistakes, you may have missed some high yield material, the more and more you practice the high yield, the more and more your mistakes will be low yield material. Staying consistent in reviewing mistakes will only expand your knowledge of the low yield material. So as you solve more and more low yield questions over time, not only can you use the high yield material to process and eliminate some answers away, sometimes you'll just straight up know the answer to a low yield question because it's something you've screwed up before. So, even though you'll miss low yield material on your first couple practice tests, over time, you'll only get better at answering these questions. So by the time you finish reviewing all the material, you're going to be very burnt out. If you're also trying to study in a month like I did, don't worry, this is the most time you will put into studying over the course of a week. For reference, here's the schedule that I use to mass review the MCAT material on the first week after my first practice test. You'll notice that I reviewed topics from the same MCAT session on the same day. And I think it's important to keep things consistent so your brain can get used to thinking about concepts in conjunction with one another so you can do best on each respective section. I also started off my week with chem and physics, which were the two concepts that I felt I was conceptually the weakest on, and also I just wanted to get them out of the way because physics is it's just not my favorite. If you're like me at the time and you're dreading doing just tons of physics problems to prepare for the physics part of the C&P section, there's a trick I figured out that was pretty effective when I was studying. Since MCAT can only test you on math that you can do mentally because you can't use a calculator, the truth is if the physics equation contains a constant that's using some crazy number, it's probably not going to be on the test, at least not in problem format where you have to plug in constants and solve the equation. My best advice to you is just kind of memorize how these equations look, but understand what they mean conceptually, and you should be good to go. So, the only physics problems you should be practicing and solving are anything contained in the high yield sections. Don't torture yourself more than you need to. So that's pretty much how I reviewed content. I would just go through half the book each day, splitting it up by sections. So on Monday, I read half the chem book and half the physics book, and then on Tuesday, I read the second half of the chem book and the second half of the physics book. And of course, by read, what I mean is I read the high yield sections, skipped or skimmed the low yield sections, and then read all the chapter reviews for the half of each respective book. Rinse and repeat for biochem on Wednesday and Thursday, and then Friday, I did the entire psychology. For all content review, I used the Kaplan books, except for Psych. For that, I used this pretty comprehensive 100-page document that Khan Academy made online. It basically takes everything from the Psych book and just summarizes it more concisely, and I highly recommend you guys use that too. As a note, I did not even look at the Orgo book because I tutored it over the summer and I felt really comfortable with it, but if you're going to try a schedule similar to this and you feel like you need to review Orgo, make sure you put in time for that as well. At this time, I wasn't super worried about cars, but I was practicing maybe like 1 or 2 passages every other day or so. I think the key to improving your car score is just consistent practice over time. So sooner rather than later, try to read some cars passages and just get a feel for the section. Getting through all the material in a week is pretty tough, but if you stick to the high yield stuff and skim through the low yield stuff, I have no doubts that anyone can do it. With my schedule, I probably studied about 6 to 7 hours each day, and I was definitely feeling pretty burnt out by the end of the week. But needless to say, I was pretty excited to take my practice test now that I had all the material under my belt, and was definitely looking to improve my score to something that was showing me that I was making progression. I was looking to improve my score by at least 5 points, and luckily I managed to get a 506 on my second practice test. I still had to go up another 5 points for next week's test, so I was definitely looking to find more practice and assess my weak points in order to accomplish this. So with that being said, let's move on to week 2.
Today I didn't even have to use my AK. I gotta say it was a good day.
The MCAT is hard and the MCAT is important. And to do well on the exam, it matters how you prep and not just.
Here's a question you need to ask yourself. What kind of student are you? Are you an aggressive procrastinator? Someone who consistently pulls all-nighters to review material for a test in a caffeine-induced manic state only to forget it immediately after the test is done? Or are you actually a good student who keeps up with the class, looking to learn the material when it's taught instead of just regurgitating it back onto a test for a good grade? If you really learned the material from your classes, chances are you remembered a lot of it when you were doing the content review, which is great because now you can spend more time practicing the material rather than ensuring you've memorized it. However, if you're like me and you realize you've forgotten a lot of stuff from class during the content review, it's important that you consistently review the material over and over again so you can ensure you've retained it. I accomplished this by, again, reading all the chapter summaries to do a full review of the content. I think regardless of whether or not you feel comfortable remembering the material your first time going through the content, it's important to brush up on the sections that you're missing questions about on the practice test, even if you don't want to do a full content review. If I miss something on the practice test, I try to look up a video or just read this section really carefully. It's also really good to come up with mnemonics or look some of those up online to help you remember the material that you're struggling to remember. Rereading the material over and over again will only familiarize you with it and strengthen your overall understandings over time. So this is why at the beginning of each week from here on out, I took 3 days to review all of the content. But if you're someone that remembers a lot of this material from school, you can go ahead and skip doing a lot of this content review, instead focus more on the second important part, which is practice.
We're talking about practice, man.
Speaking of practice, the second week is when I consistently started practicing cars. Yes, cars is very painful, but do it every day. Even if it's just like 1 or 2 passages, that's all you need. I'll go into a little more detail about car strategy later, but daily practice is by far the best thing you can do to improve your score quickly. So what type of test prep is the best? Personally, I think it's really hard to say because there are a bajillion different ways you can prepare for the MCAT. However, I do think that taking MCAT practice passages is the best way to prepare yourself for taking the actual test. This is compared to doing the problems in the back of your review books or studying Anki decks or flashcards. That's because actually doing MCAT practice passages tests your ability to read and use problem solving, 2 skills that are fundamental in doing well on the MCAT. And also 2 skills that are not maybe as well tested on, let's say, a flashcard that just gives you a multiple choice question. or a flashcard that only has the definition of the term. I was very fortunate to have a friend who was actually a part of a test prep program, so he gave me access to a lot of passages that I was very fortunate to be able to use. However, if you don't have access to practice passages, one really helpful thing you can do is retake passages from practice tests you've already taken. This is an amazing and I believe a very underutilized strategy because it allows you to assess your weak points, which really can be one of two things: the content or the test itself. If you reviewed all of the content and you know all the mistakes you made on the test, but you're still struggling to finish in time or get all the right answers on the test, chances are your weakness is not actually the content, but your ability to take the test effectively. I think this is a really important distinction to make because a lot of people won't be doing well on tests, but they'll think it's because of the content. So they'll dump all their time into the content only to realize later that they're not analyzing the paragraph effectively and they're not getting the right information from the passage. I think the hardest thing for a lot of people on the MCAT is getting the important material out of a super dense scientific paragraph, which sadly is like all the MCAT tests. I'm going to talk about my strategy for reading these passages later in the video, but just like anything, practice makes perfect, right? So if you're retaking an old passage and you know the content, but you're still missing questions, that means you're going to have to work on developing your abilities and your strategies to reading figures and passages quickly and effectively. If this is something you're weak on, strengthening your understanding of the content is only going to help you so much. You really need to take the time to reread passages and come up with strategies that allow you to take the test effectively. But if you're taking new passages and there's a whole bunch of content that you've never seen before, then that means it's time to practice the content instead. Really understanding what your weakness is the key to studying for the MCAT quickly. Personally, a lot of people find Anki decks or flashcards to be really useful tools to study. And while I personally didn't use Anki decks, I do think they can be really useful, especially if you understand that they're used to practice the content and not necessarily the test-taking strategy. But again, if you're already strong on content, Anki is not going to be the most useful thing to improving your score. If you're instead weak on test-taking strategies, using things like UWorld or Atlea's test prep are definitely going to help you refine those skills and see improvements in your score. For test-taking strategy, there's also something called the section banks, and in the next part of the video, I'm going to talk in depth about why these section banks are so good. But for now, I would hold off on doing them until you feel like your understanding of the content is really good and you're looking to refine your test-taking abilities and your understanding of low-yield material. During my second week of studying, I found that I was definitely weak in both content and my test-taking strategies, especially leaning towards the content side. So in my schedule, I left plenty of time to review the content over and over again. And on days where I reviewed the content, I made sure to practice sections so I could also hone my test-taking strategies. Again, I just want to reiterate that there are a million ways you could study for the MCAT. While there's definitely no right way, taking old passages on old MCATs is definitely going to allow you to assess your weak points, and from there, it's all about finding the right test prep materials that allow you to see improvements in your weaknesses. Along the way, make sure you're writing down all of your mistakes from the practice sections and review them as consistently as possible before your next practice test. After another super long week of studying, I was definitely ready to see if I could hit my threshold again on the practice test. And luckily, I was able to go up another 5 points. I was definitely pretty stoked about my C&P and bio sections, but was worried about my cars a little bit and definitely my psychology section. Especially because at the time, I felt like I had a really good understanding of psych, so I wasn't sure why that score was lagging behind all the others. But in the next section, I'm going to talk about what I figured out to help me improve my score, as well as the test-taking strategies that I used to do well on the day of the test. So, let's move on. On the third week of studying, I was looking to fine-tune the test-taking strategies I would use on the day of the test. This is when I found out about the section banks. The section banks contain 100 passage-based and non-passage-based questions for each of the sections of the MCAT. But these questions are hard. Like, unless you are Sal Khan or the second coming of pre-med Jesus, you are going to get railed the first time trying to do these questions. But that is precisely what makes them such an amazing tool to study. There are two main reasons why the section banks are so dank. The first reason is MCAT section banks will significantly strengthen your understanding of MCAT content. Not only will it strengthen your understanding of high yield material, it'll significantly expand your knowledge of low yield material as well. The second reason is it'll give you tons of practice to hone and strengthen your test taking strategies. If you can come up with test taking strategies that work on the section banks, they will definitely work on the actual MCAT. Taking the section banks, I would say, is just as important as taking full-length tests because they allow you to practice the two things that are most important to doing well in the MCAT: your understanding of the content and your test-taking strategies. So, during my third week of studying, I once again reviewed all the content by reading the chapter reviews and made plenty of time to do all the questions on each section bank. I also made sure to make plenty of time to practice cars, review some flashcards, and look over my mistakes from the previous test. Before we move on to the test taking strategies, it's important to note that improving your score past the 510 point is going to be much harder than getting to 510 in the first place. It's going to take a lot of patience and a real commitment to understanding what it is that you're weak on. Doing the section banks and reviewing your mistakes are going to be instrumental in helping you improve your score past the 510 point. With enough practice and patience, I believe anyone is capable of getting a 515 or a 520 on the MCAT. Alright. Now let's talk about strategy. In this part of the video, I'm going to walk through a couple problems that illustrate test taking strategies that are good for all the STEM sections of the MCAT. At the end, I'll talk about cars, but for now, let's start with Psych.
This is the art of guessing. Let's take a look at this question, which is actually the first one asked on the Psych section bank in regards to this passage. If you want to try to do the question on your own by reading the passage, go ahead and pause the video here. The passage is talking about a military trial designed to assess attention, but the question itself is referring to phase 1. A trial where participants were presented with two different stimuli, one to an attended and one to a non-attended ear. Participants were then supposed to repeat back anything they heard in the attended ear. Now let's go back to the question. When I first saw this, I immediately answered C. Recall is a high yield topic, and I was confident that the researchers were asking participants to recall the information from their attended ear. But it turns out the correct answer to this question is actually choice A. Even though recall seems to really fit this question well, it turns out recall refers to accessing something that's already been stored in memory. Shadowing, on the other hand, is repeating back a stimulus that's been presented to you. And since that's what the researchers asked the participants to do in this question, this is the correct answer. Recall is a high yield term, and it's actually something that I've answered correctly on other tests, but it shows that I did not have the exact understanding of the term that I thought I had. This example is a perfect illustration of why the section banks are so good, and illustrates the importance of a test-taking strategy that I'm going to call concept reflection, which is really just the act of double-checking yourself away from your gut feeling guess, and really making sure that concepts fit the question you're trying to answer.
I think this is the key realization that actually helped me improve my Psych section. The Psych section is full of these very ambiguously worded and defined terms. And honestly, the wording in the questions is not that much better. There was a question on my actual MCAT that I am certain had two correct answers. Carefully reading the questions and really considering the direct application of certain concepts is going to massively improve your score.
Let's quickly go through a couple more questions that show the importance of using concept reflection to make smart guesses. At first glance, I think it's pretty easy to remove the naming explosion and bootstrapping from the correct answer pool. Bootstrapping, I remember, has to do with language acquisition, which doesn't seem relevant to the question. The naming explosion also kind of has to do with language acquisition, but refers to a developmental stage where you're naming a lot of different objects different things, rather than generalizing as the question is describing. This left me between B and C, which were both terms that I hadn't really seen before. At first, C seemed like a home run answer, and it was actually what I ended up choosing the first time through this test. It seemed to me that she was categorizing and grouping stimuli and perceiving them all to be butterflies. After flagging it and coming back to it later though, this answer seemed a little too good to be true. It almost fit the question too well. I was suspicious that AAMC might be trying to finesse me into going with my gut feeling. The more I thought about it, overextension fits the topic pretty well too. She could be overextending her concept of a butterfly to other objects. And looking even further into it, categorical things are usually pretty general. Butterfly is a very specific category, and I would expect a category to be more something like animals or shapes. After really reflecting on this question, I eventually ended up switching my answer to B, which was the correct answer. Let's take a look at one more question from the same test. Upon reading this question, I knew I was going to have to guess right away, because I'd never heard of the glass escalator concept before. You can eliminate C pretty quickly, because role conflict has to do with the strain that's put on you when you're trying to balance more than one role, and that doesn't really apply to this question. After that, there was a pattern I recognized. B and D are both referring to detriments of being a man in a female-dominated industry, specifically with regards to not being able to get a promotion, while A, on the other hand, indicates that a man is more likely to get a promotion in a female-dominated industry. The term escalator seems to symbolize some sort of ascension of power or climbing in rank. If glass escalator really referred to choice B or D here, they did a terrible job naming the concept, and I did the best I could making a guess. So I ended up picking A, which once again was the correct answer. Now that we've talked about a strategy you can use for non-passage based questions, let's talk about how to tackle the passages and the figures themselves. When you first dive into a passage, I recommend a questions-based approach that I'm going to call term searching. The goal of which is to save time and limit confusion by reading the questions first. If you start reading the passage without looking at the questions, you'll inevitably have to reread the passage anyways once you finally do get to the questions. This means you'll have read the passage twice and wasted a lot of time doing so. Instead, you should read the questions first so you can get an idea of what type of information you should be looking for while you're reading the passage. Once you've identified the key terms from the answers in the question, you should look over your passage and see where they pop up in the reading itself. This way you'll know which sections you can skim over and which sections you'll need to read more carefully. If you're still confused on how this works, there's an example coming up that I think will illustrate this process well. This leads me to a strategy you can use while you're reading the passage, which which I'm going to call relationship tracking. This basically just consists of coming up with your own note-taking strategy to keep track of all the relationships within the passage. Some passages or figures can have many different interconnected relationships. Trying to keep all these relationships in your head can make answering questions extremely difficult and time-consuming, as you have to go back through the passage to keep remembering the relationships. Keeping track of the relationships as you come across them in the passage helps solve this problem. Now, I'll walk you through my thought process and my note-taking as I try to solve this question. When I start reading the passage, I'm going to make sure to keep an eye out for delta F508, as well as CFTR. I'm also going to need to keep my eyes peeled for typhoid fever and cystic fibrosis, as they both seem relevant to the question. Ultimately, to answer this question, I will need to figure out what the relationship between these two alleles are with typhoid fever and cystic fibrosis. With all that in mind, now let's move to the passage. Because I've already thought about what I should be looking for, 3 of the 4 terms immediately catch my eye in the first paragraph, and this is where I'm going to start reading. I also noticed that typhoid fever is not really mentioned until the last paragraph, meaning that in order to answer this question effectively, I'm going to need to read and critically think about the whole passage. Pause the video here if you want to try to do the question on your own. After reading through this passage, I found 4 important things that are relevant to answering the question and decided to take shorthand notes on 3 of them. The first of which is that the delta F508 gene is actually a mutated version of the CFTR gene. The second important thing that I found is that people who are homozygous for this mutated gene exhibit cystic fibrosis. I made a note that looked like this and then continued on through the passage. The third important thing is that increased levels of CFTR internalize more S-type, which is what ends up causing typhoid fever. This is the note that I made to show that if you have increased CFTR, you have more S-type and therefore more typhoid fever. Finally, and intuitively, if you're heterozygous for the mutant allele, you have less CFTR and therefore you're less likely to express typhoid fever. These are what my final notes looked like before I went back to the answer choices. With these notes, it makes answering this question a breeze. Let's start with choice A. If we look at our third bullet point in the notes, we can clearly see that heterozygous people are actually less susceptible to fever, and we could eliminate this right away. By the same logic, we can also eliminate choice B, which also claims that heterozygotes are more susceptible to typhoid fever. With regards to answer choice C, we can look back at our first bullet point in the notes and clearly see that it's homozygotes, not heterozygotes, that exhibit cystic fibrosis, and thus this answer is incorrect as well. Then only option D remains, which is the correct choice. Obviously, my handwriting is trash and my note-taking system is very different than what yours might be, but come up with your own system that works on test day.
Alright, finally, let's talk about cars. Because everyone reads and processes information differently, I don't think there's one underlying car strategy that is good for everyone. You're going to need to figure out what works best for you. But there are 2 things that I really like doing that I want to suggest. The first is read the passage carefully. Cars is a time crunch, and so many people are going to want to skip through the passage so they can get to the questions and have as much time to answer them as possible. But the problem is you're going to have to reread the passage anyways to make sure that your answer is right. If you just skim through the passage and you see a question and you're not even sure what they're talking about, or you have to reread the passage just to figure out the section that they are talking about in the question, it wastes so much time that you could have saved if you just read the passage carefully the first time. So please, don't try to cut corners and read the passage super fast unless you just absorb information like crazy. The second thing is before you start each new section, close your eyes and just take like a 5 or 10 second break. Cars is a section of regrets. You will literally always be second guessing your answers. Taking a moment to close your eyes and just clear your mind will help you start the new section fresh. This will help you divert your attention away from the question asking about the symbolism in ancient Roman architecture so that you can fully focus on reading the philosophical implications of graphic design. You will still be bored out of your mind either way. So, after another long week of doing the section bank problems and studying, I was ready to take my final full-length test. And luckily, I was able to pop off, scoring a 516 on my final attempt. Not gonna lie, I was probably more excited to get this score than I was getting my score back from the actual test. This is because this is the first time that I hit my original goal of 512, and it was above even my dream score of 515. I was ready to get this bread. So, let's talk a little bit about getting mentally ready for test day. Going into the test, I was very confident that no matter how I performed on test day, I knew what I needed to know to do very well in the exam. And that's a really important mindset to have, because you want to go into the test with no regrets. You never want to leave the test feeling like if you just waited another month or postponed your test, you could have done so much better. If you're hitting your target scores on your practice tests, you know what you need to know and you're ready. Be confident in yourself. I still have 4 days before my test day, so I could have taken the sample test if I wanted to for extra practice, but I didn't want to do anything that would shatter my confidence. Like, what if I dropped like a 510 on the sample test and now I'm just sitting here like... Instead, I opted to use my last 4 days to just keep reviewing the content, do things I've done before, and review all of my mistakes that I made throughout the course of studying. On the day before the test, some people don't like to study at all, I personally at least wanted to review the mistakes that I made, maybe brush up on a couple things here and there, but overall I kept the studying super light. An important thing you need to do before test day is reset your sleep schedule. You're already going to have enough trouble as is trying to fall asleep before your test due to anxiety. If you've been going to bed at like 4 or 5 a.m. while you're studying, which is pretty normal, you need to reset this and have a normal sleep schedule by the time test day rolls around. Getting up early will allow you to go to bed sooner, and it'll also allow you to get a head start on your studying for the day. So if you start doing this the week before your test, in no time you'll be back to a normal sleep schedule. Or you could just do what I did and slam melatonin 2 days before the test, like a boss. The last thing that's important for test day is establishing routines. Whatever you're eating before your practice test and whatever you're eating for lunch during the breaks of your practice test, try to eat the same thing on the day of the actual test too. Same thing with how you choose to caffeinate yourself. If you're only drinking 1 coffee for practice test, don't slam like 4 monsters a day before the actual test. Sleep, eat, and drink the same amount that you did for the practice test on the day of the normal test. Keeping things consistent will make you feel more comfortable and make you do better as well. So some of you might be wondering how I did on my actual test. Coming out of the test, I felt not so good. And from what I've heard, it sounds like pretty much everyone feels the same way after they take their test. Our chem physics section was heavily leaning towards the physics side, and on top of that, they asked me a ton of low yield material that I just had not seen before. So I had to make a lot of educated guesses. That being said though, I felt like my guesses were pretty good, and I felt like I took a good cars section and psych section. So at the very least, I knew I was probably gonna get a 512, which was my goal anyways. After a very stressful month of waiting for my test score, I finally got my test back and I lucked out, managing to score 517 on my actual MCAT. I was honestly super stoked with my score and wondering if maybe I could have even gotten a 520 if I'd taken an extra month or 2 to study. But to be honest, I don't know if I really would have been able to get a 520 because the chances of me increasing my score from 517 to 520 are way harder than me increasing my score from 510 to 517. And on top of that, I just really did not want to study another month for the MCAT. I don't know about you, but speed is the name of the game. I'm trying to get in and out as quickly as possible. One final thing I will say though is if you are someone that's aiming for a 520 on their MCAT, getting a 130 in each of the STEM sections is probably not going to be that hard for you. But no matter how smart you are, cars will be. It's not too hard to be able to keep your STEM sections in the 130 to 132 range, but keeping your car score there is extremely difficult and takes a lot of practice. So if you want a 520, make cars a super integral part of your study plan. And that's pretty much all I have for this video. If you guys enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like down below. Or if you have any comments or questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them in the comment section too. I guess you could subscribe too, but honestly, I don't really make videos very often. This was my first YouTube video and I really enjoyed making it, so if you have other ideas for videos I should make in the future, please let me know in the comments down below. Best of luck studying for the MCAT, and I will see you all next time.